Hi everyone. Huge thank you to everyone for joining us today. I know some of you may have been on one of our change chats already, but some of you may not have done. So I just thought I'd give you a little bit of an introduction. So huge thank you for joining us. These change chats that we're running are part of a series of us understanding really how we can learn from the change that's happened so fast during COVID and what we can take away from that. Today is going to be just quite an informal session. We do mute people as they come into the room just so we can avoid some background noise, but please do engage. Please do post any questions in the group chat and we will try and answer them as best as we can. We are recording the session so that we can put it, it'll just be an audio recording that we'll put on YouTube for people that have missed the session. In terms of what we want to talk about today, so I guess I'm on a bit of a mission really. I think that we have spent many years accepting that change is really difficult and that it takes forever and it's hard work. And actually recently it has shown that yes, it is hard work, but it can happen quickly. It can happen through empowering other people. It can happen in a kind of distributed leadership way rather than these sort of 2 to 3 year change programs with lots of paperwork. So really want to learn from that. And I guess the thing about the COVID crisis is that everyone has been affected. Everyone has gone through some sort of significant change in recent weeks. And what we know is there's more to come because change is constant. You know, we're only really at the start of this. I'm sure all of us in our own ways, whether it's in our personal life and our professional life, we're going to continue to be impacted and affected by the change that this is creating. And whether your job is to drive the change or experience the change, it's going to have a profound effect on all of us and continue to do so. And we know that when change is done right, amazing things can happen, but when it's done wrong, it can cost time and money and have an emotional impact. So it is really important to just take an opportunity to kind of learn from this as we go. So huge thank you to our speakers for being part of this and offering their views. So we've got a real mix of people from different organisations today. We've got Carol Costello, who's the Director of People and Services at the University of Liverpool, so coming from that education background. We've got Sanjay McIntosh, who's the owner of Roreti Management Consultancy. Sanjay's been working very closely with Haringey Council, responding to the crisis there. We have Alistair Sinclair, who's a cabinet member for Communities and Social Justice of Lancaster City Council, again, been quite involved in that response to how we continue to support communities. And we have Norman Goodwin, who's the Chief Exec of Adoption Matters. Adoption Matters is a voluntary sector organisation and they've obviously had to respond in their own way to the crisis. So, huge thank you for taking part. Sanjay, if it's okay, I'm going to come to you first and just ask you, how have you managed to make change happen so quickly recently and what can we learn from
that? Thanks, Lucy. I always like the first questions because they're so open and broad that I personally struggle to do that in a succinct timescale, Lucy, but I will do it this time to allow others to come in. How did change happen so far? I think the simplest answer is that people did what they thought was right to kind of support the people who were largely most in need during this crisis phase that we're now slowly emerging from. And I think that principle of doing what's right has really driven particular bits of activity and change, and in a lot of cases accelerated change at an organisation level in terms of relationships in the community, relationships with each other. I use that term support in particular because largely people have needed, as they normally do in a crisis, support. And it's just in this particular crisis, the nature of the support that people have needed has been multifaceted. Normally during a crisis, in a local authority context at least, it's a single thing that's happened. It doesn't last particularly long, or it's a bit more time limited than this situation, but it's about a particular thing that's needed. It could be community safety, it could be public health, could be other things, but this has actually been a public health pandemic that's affected a much broader set of circumstances and actually exacerbated things in particular communities that we may have already known about. So I, as Lucy introduced, have been supporting a London Borough, Haringey, which actually the analysis that's taken place post the crisis phase of COVID-19 this year has shown that one of the wards, Tottenham, has now gone to being the most deprived ward in the country. Local authority ward, and has 26,500 people furloughed as it currently stands, of which many of those would probably end up losing their jobs as they go through. And so in that context, in a borough that I was working in, how did we kind of make change happen so fast? Well, firstly, it was knowing that those people were in those circumstances. So we looked very, very quickly at what we knew about people, what we knew about communities, what we knew the challenges to be already. And things started to appear immediately. Food poverty generally, but food in particular. What does that look like? Economic poverty, so number of jobs, businesses, what sort of state they were in. And as we kind of went towards the lockdown phase, we sort of knew what the challenges might be, but then the game-changing moment, as you know, was lockdown. And what that did was throw us into a situation where we had to react and respond. But knowing that particular parts of that borough were going to need more support than others, we were able to react quicker and then just do what was right. So I spoke on the last one of these calls about the food operation I happened to kind of coordinate on behalf of Haringey Council, so emergency food provision. And as many of you who have been involved in that before have probably, who were involved in that particular thing that was needed across the country in the last few months would know, it's just not the sort of thing a local authority has necessarily done before. But you know that if people need food, you need to get it to them. And doing the kind of getting it done fast is simply saying, who's with me? How do we do this? And design it and get on with it and try and do it as you go. And so I think, I would hold on to that principle of doing what is right, but really, really doing it from a position of really understanding who your community are, who the people are, what their circumstances are, and what was needed in that particular crisis. So I'll stop there for now, Lucy.
Thank you, Sanjay. Carol, do you want to have a bash at answering the question? How did you, because I know you've had to quite radically change how your university operates. How do you think you managed to make that happen so quickly?
Yeah, so thanks for that. I guess you would not imagine that universities, you either imagine them as organisations that are, the thought leaders at the front of research, discoveries, putting things into play, or you see us as perhaps part of the bureaucracy of today's society. And I have to say, it's been a huge emotional roller coaster in moving us forward. If you think about a university that has students working they're on placement around the world, they're doing year abroad, or they might be doing a semester abroad. We had to evacuate people from countries all over the world in a very short space of time and get them back here, not necessarily with all their belongings. So that left us with a bit of a challenge. We had to instantly get everybody off campus, as many people as we could home, and start delivering education online, which of course in a face-to-face institution setting, that was obviously a bit of a challenge for us. And also then ensure that everybody was able, that could work at home, worked at home. We had to therefore do things like roll out Teams and Zoom overnight, actually, make sure that everybody got the equipment they needed, and work out how we could get that equipment to people at home. How could we make sure that their environment was safe and that they were comfortable. We had to do things like, we've just had to graduate all our medical students online, because without their graduation, they couldn't go to work in the NHS. So that's just a sample of things that we had to do. So in terms of just answering the question, I would say the first thing that we did was accept that none of this was going to be perfect, right? So forget the perfection bit, just do it. We had to understand people's fears and anxieties and be flexible. So empowered people to take responsibility for sorting out some of their own fears and worries. We had to free up the bureaucracy. So like other public sector organisations, quite bureaucratic, we go through loads of committees. So our council has been meeting originally weekly with us, 5 o'clock, having an hour's meeting, just getting the business done, not with papers, not with anything else, just saying this is what we're doing, any issues, flag them to us. We also did something where we flipped the responsibility. So normally we've got quite a hierarchical institution. So, you know, the top make the decisions and whatever. What we said was, actually, you're responsible. You tell us what you need. You know, as senior managers, we'll facilitate that rather than it being something that you have to ask our permission from. Just say what you want to do that's going to make this work, and then we'll make it work for you. And the last thing I'd say is having a shared purpose. And I think the whole country has had a shared purpose. But if we put out there what our shared purpose is, you know, which is to educate our students, to make them safe, to get them back home, those that couldn't go home, to make their environment lovely and make sure they got food and all that sort of thing. That was our shared purpose. And so, you know, forget about anything else. Those are the things we've got to do. So maybe narrow down your purpose, because that enables you to focus on the things that are really important to you. So I think I'll stop there, and hopefully that's a bit of food for thought.
Thank you, Carol. Alistair, how do you think, what was key for making change happen so quickly for you?
I'm still considering it. I think it's day 95 of lockdown. I keep a track of it every day, or day 103 if you regard the first week. I think three things really: planning and pre-planning, because we were up in this neck of the woods. We'd had a number of emergencies with Storm Desmond and a number of other things. So there was quite a strong pre-planning structure for that immediate emergency, and that fed into our Lancashire Resilience Forum. So there's the planning stuff. I haven't been particularly involved in that side of things as a cabinet member, but certainly from officers' perspective, the fact that they had those structures, and the second thing that I think is the most important, relationships, that they had the relationships in place from a logistics point of view, so they could kind of immediately focus on kind of identifying three core areas. And we focus, we very quickly focused on vulnerable people, support for local businesses, and maintenance of our core services. And because of the pre-planning, because of the relationships, from a council delivery point of view, we were able to reconfigure very quickly. But going back to relationships, we already had, I wouldn't say tremendously amazing, but we had a reasonable level of connections to our voluntary sector, to our other statutory sectors. And we'd spent a bit of time in the previous, again, this is kind of lucky really, about 6 months previously, we'd employed and created a community connector team. And that was a reflection of a new focus with the new administration, which came in last May, around kind of taking a much more kind of strength-based, I bang on about asset-based community development, much more strength-based approach to how we worked with our local communities. So we'd already had about 6 months of starting to map. And when I came into post, and that was only last May, the year last May, it was apparent that there were a lot of big gaps in the district around what we knew, around the sort of strengths, capacity, the abundance that was in the community. But because we'd done six months of work on that, we were a little bit further down the road. So we kind of developed some of our relationships. And I think the third thing is communication. So this is where I sort of came in, I suppose, with a couple of other cabinet members, three of us. We focused from the first week really on establishing in this new virtual world connections with our community. Obviously, it's going to be limited because some people don't have access. So I think from more or less week one, we established regular meetings focused on Lancaster, focused on the rural areas, different meetings, rural areas, and on Morecambe. So we established meetings on a weekly basis. We pulled together a meeting focused around volunteering and mutual aid. That was a driver for the more mapping. ABCD it's all about mapping, it's all about relationships, and it's all about connecting. But that was a driver for us making much more visible the support, the community support that was out there. Pretty quickly, I think within a couple of weeks, we established it pretty much across the district, and we're interesting because we're town, seaside, and country. We established that there was something like in the rural areas around 1,000, just over 1,000 people who'd joined local kind of village focused, occasionally parish council focused support groups. So our weekly meeting with the rural areas was an opportunity for us to share what we were doing from a council perspective and have constant weekly feedback. And there is now we've got a scribble map out there. So if anyone wants to find support in the Lancaster district, community-led support, they can find it. It's there. They can see in all the villages, pretty much all the villages in the Lancaster district and Lancaster and Morecambe, there's community-led support. And because of that support, we didn't see as high a demand for the volunteer support stuff that we kind of led on in partnership with a couple of local community organisations, the local CVS and a church called Hope Church. Hope Church already had a support structure in place. They had something like 130 volunteers, and we supported them and the CVS in coming together to create a volunteer hub. And we could do that quite quickly because they already had the systems in place. So I think my kind of overall reflection, and I'm still reflecting, is that we were able to move quite fast because there'd been an element of planning, but most importantly, we had good, strong relationships, and we put in place communication to build those relationships. So I now know, 15, 16 weeks later, I know a lot of people in lots of different agencies, in villages. I've never met them. I just see their pictures on screens. I have a much stronger sense of the community strengths that exist, and that's informing how we're moving forward post-COVID. I think I said it in the last meeting, we're in one kind of emergency, but the biggest emergency that we're in is the climate emergency. And while we are, if you like, dealing with the immediate, the long term is quite challenging. I think that's enough for me for now.
Thank you, Alistair. Norman, what's been your experience of making things happen quickly over the last 3 months?
Well, people will look back and see whether we have been quick, but I think to echo some of the previous speakers, so as an organisation, we cover quite a large geographical area of the north of England. We are a voluntary adoption agency, so the name, as it says on the name, is what it does in the tin, really. So we are quite a disparate organisation in terms of geography. So we already had quite a lean system in place for people, quite a number of our staff who were home workers. We had a reasonable technology in place. So the sort of move to walk out the door on a Friday afternoon and say we are going to become sort of a home working organisation on a Monday wasn't actually too traumatic an event. We had also, in relation to that discussion around pre-planning, there had been quite a lot of discussion in the organisation where we were trying to engineer or encourage greater use of technology. And so people were equipped with the technology, and our telephony and our computer systems allowed us to do most of that. But in some of the things that we were discussing in moving us towards a more technologically outsourced system, there's nothing like a push of a crisis to get over some of the issues that there's always some problem with, or there's always some need to have further discussion about before we do that. So that concept of just getting on with it is a wonderful thing to actually have to do sometimes. So in terms of our office moving to that sort of new concept, that has worked, I think, exceedingly well. The issue for us as well is not only is about how we as an organisation have coped through the crisis, it's a bit about the people that we work with. How do they cope with the working? And we, as you can imagine, work in quite a policy, procedurally restricted piece of work. There is a lot of forms that have to be filled in. There are a lot of processes that have to be gone through. And to move from a situation where a lot of that work is done face to face with people to having information events online, having initial stage 1 visits with people, going through the home assessment, which can be maybe 8-10 sessions, doing all the other bits of work which are normally done face to face, taking references, which is usually done face to face. To do a lot of that on technology has been challenging, and there has had to be some legal changes that have had to be put in place to allow us to do some of those things. And we have done that in a context of, we have had unprecedented numbers of people who have come forward thinking that they might be potential adoptive parents. I think I said on one of these, on the previous session, that we wondered whether or not people had nothing else to do and were looking just to find out something to read, or maybe come to something that was not watching the television. But actually the quality of people's applications has been exceptional, and I think it boils down to the fact that people have had time to actually think about new challenges, new things in their life, just re-evaluating some of the things that they do in their life. And adoption has been one of those things that a lot of people have taken on board. So we've had more than double the number of applications that we've had to take forward in the context of a virtual preparation. So on all of those things, I think the thing that has really challenged us is, well, not challenged us, but has been a pleasant surprise, is that a number of people have really embraced the opportunity to take on board some of this technology and really run with it and become innovative and inventive about how we use the things. And you know, we don't, a larger proportion of our staff are, and I have to be careful what I say, are of a more mature generation, but they have really grasped some of the technology in a way that has surprised themselves, which I think has been really encouraging for people and given them an energy and an enthusiasm and a sense of achievement in some of those things, which I think has been really great for the organisation. So I think as I embark now, I think, well, what has some of this new stuff made obsolete for us in the past? And you know, what have we on balance, what have we lost, or what do we actually need to think about going forward? And I think there's a lot of what we've done through this crisis that will now become established parts of our practice and our procedure. So that's great, and I hope that we can embrace some of that going forward and we don't revert back to how we've always done it. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Norman. I'm really interested to hear from other people who are on the call. Please do put in the chat room what you think has enabled change to happen so quickly in your organisation. And we've got a really good question from Lizzie, I guess is the opposite question. So what were the barriers that were there previously? So I'm sure all of us on the call have been part of change programmes prior to COVID. What were the barriers that might have been there previously that actually weren't there this time round, and what can we learn from that? And would anybody like to take that one? Carol?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've responded to Lizzie a bit, and Sanjay's said the same thing. I think we know that change can be really, really slow because of the fear and anxiety that people have, and so we spend an awful lot of time trying to concentrate our efforts on addressing those fears and anxieties. We can't address them all, but I think, but you know, we all were sharing the same fear and anxiety actually, which was this unknown thing called COVID-19, and so our direction was on fear and anxiety there, as opposed to fear and anxiety in terms of the job. And that just enabled us to do that. We, you know, I have to say, Mercenary, we played on that and said, you know, okay, we know you're all worried about that. Let's get this. Well, what can we focus on? What have we got control over? What are the things that we can do that are, you know, work related, to take your mind off that fear and stuff that's going on behind. So that's, I think you need to look at your opportunities, which I think Norman said really. You sort of, when you've got a burning platform, you tend to focus on something that is well, how do we get out of this? And I think that's what gave us the opportunity to do that.
I think some of these things people are naturally I don't know, reserved about what they can achieve in these things, and sometimes it has required that additional challenge for people to take on board some of the things. And actually, some of the things that people have taken on board, they've achieved very easily, and I think they've taken great encouragement. So the barrier is sometimes about what do we believe in ourselves that we have the ability to do, and I think people just having the opportunity. I think Carol said it, the context about just saying this won't be perfect, you know, just to say, well, get on with it, and we'll explore this, and if it's a disaster, it's not the end of the world, but we can have another go. And people tried things, they did things, and then they would say, and I learnt this and I learnt that. So people said, right, well, we'll do that the next time. And somebody else says, well, have you done this, or did you consider this? And they've done that, and it's progressed every time. So there's been that shared willingness to experiment together, if we can call it that.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd agree with colleagues on that, and I think what I put in the chat was that we do have to recognise how different this particular situation has been, and how that has played a significant part in the acceleration of change. I tried to be brief, but we didn't explain everything that I was probably the meaning behind what I was saying fully in the chat. But you know, if you have something like this that affects every part of society, well, we are part of it. We work for organisations that have responsibility to do something within the kind of communities that we work in, live in, whatever, or both in some cases. And so for the organisation that I've been working with, it's a 2,500 person organisation that covers 260,000 people in 8 square miles. It's a classic London borough, densely populated areas of affluence, areas of deprivation, sometimes on top of each other. And actually, where you have as an organisation that provides a ton of services to support people, and quite a lot of bureaucracy, let's be honest, that sort of sits above that, and in some respects contributes to the fear and anxiety that Carol has described really well already. Well, when you're in a situation where every single bit of that organisation shares something, and will define it and describe it differently. So they might talk about their family and how this is affecting them, or they might say, you know, in my role as a corporate lead on digital, I need to be able to make sure MS Teams works for our staff. Or in the community sense, people are saying, I know how much the scale of poverty and how much people need food because they're now ringing our customer services line, and the demand is going up. It was all about the same thing, but described differently. When it's all about the same thing, people say, well, what do we do? And I really like Norman's reflections about, well, what do we do? And what we were doing, like others probably on the call were doing, was talking to everybody, VCS organisations, other statutory bodies, people that I'd never met, and talked to me like, well, what, you know, voluntary community sector organisations. And you just kind of go, what role do we all want to do? And then what happened just day in, day out was people going, we should try this. Maybe we should do that. Maybe we should call them. And then you start to build this sense of is that going to be a blocker, or what we worried about? Like, I can tell you now that the thing that I was worried about with the food operation was just the sheer amount of money that we were about to spend and have spent. So in a London borough, that's, I think when we're done, going to be north of about £500,000 spent. And spending money when you don't know where the money's coming from is a huge deal for a local authority and for any other organisation. You know, it's non-budgeted money, but you know that you need to provide food because people are saying, I have nowhere to eat because I can't go to a supermarket, or no, I'm shielding. And what does that mean? And so I can't emphasize enough the sort of fact that I don't think we may never see this sort of thing again, and we haven't already in our generation, but where at an organisation level, everyone relates to the problem. Every single person at the same time relates to the challenge. And then you are into a conversation much quicker about what's the right thing to do. And people going, oh, well, I can buy 200 phones and tablets to be able to provide that to people who now can't even contact us because they used to go and do that face to face. Well, I know how to do that. I'll ring this supplier. I remember calling Tottenham Hotspur and saying, I know that you're not playing football anymore. Any chance we could use your brand new stadium, or at least a part of it, to be able to distribute food to people in Tottenham because of what I said earlier, you know, the level of deprivation, the level of need that was coming from that particular area was so significant. And they said, well, yeah, we need to work through a couple of things, but let's do it. We had that conversation on the Thursday. We're there on the Saturday and started receiving and delivering food on the Monday following that. And you know, different sort of things, but I think it's just to say that the sort of normal levels of anxiety and fear that Carol, I couldn't describe it better, because you just drop that in this situation. And I think the difference has been
I think we've lost Sanjay.
Sanjay.
I guess
a lot relates to it, and there's no one doesn't.
Oh,
Did I
Sanjay.
disappear then? Was that me that disappeared for
Yeah.
a second? Sorry, I thought everyone else had. I'll go back on mute. It's saying my internet connection is unstable. I'll see if I can sort that out.
Okay.
Sorry, guys.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess I'd add, I mean, what is kind of what we're saying is the barrier was an absence of crisis, and that, you know, the very fact of having a crisis gets people to do things that they wouldn't normally have done. I mean, one concrete for us around homelessness is that pre-COVID, we had, not like some areas of the country, but certainly, you know, a significant, for us, number of people who were street homeless. And as soon as we had a crisis, and some of this in terms of the money was that we in the first week put aside £1 million. We drew on £1 million of our reserves, so that was concrete. But within a couple of weeks, we housed all those people who were street homeless, and because of that £1 million, we were able to scale up the local food support provision. But that's not to say that pre-crisis there weren't people who weren't getting the sort of food support that they needed. So there is that thing around, well, that acknowledging and being aware of the fact that you're in a crisis removes barriers. And I guess that links a little bit to some of my frustration around our climate action, because clearly we were previously in a significant crisis and we continue to be in a crisis. The other bit for barriers for me is from a local government point of view, we have a relatively limited pool of resource, of people. And 10 years of austerity has stripped that back. So most of the departments within our council have been doing, you know, have had to carry on doing what they're expected to do from a statutory perspective with less resources. So the reality is that there was very little beyond statutory that we as a council could do. So the barrier there, I mean, that's a pretty big barrier. You know, local at 60%, you know, 60p in the pound and all the rest of it. That's a big barrier. But that's, I guess that's the deficit approach. And I said I'm a big proponent of asset-based community development. What the crisis made us do, and I think we're heading in that direction, it made us look at all those strengths and all those assets that were already in the district. I mentioned Hope Church. I mean, our volunteer hub primarily exists, for the foundation of it is a local church that has been providing support because statutory services have been cut for a considerable period of time, and we weren't even really aware of it. So I guess a big barrier for me is the way that previously we think. There is the obvious concrete political barrier the denuding and destruction of local government that's been going on for quite a long time. That's a very big barrier. But the other one is that most services, most provision is delivered from a deficit-based approach. As you know, we identify some problems. We have a limited pool of people, so we get together and hold interagency meetings, and we talk to each other, and we produce protocols. And we don't get much done because we're a limited group of people. What changed in crisis was we became a community, and I think that's certainly something that at the moment is still existing. But we're moving out of well, there's differing opinions of this. Certainly Boris Johnson and his government seem to be suggesting we're moving out of crisis. And I saw something the other day about the sort of 3 psychological phases of crisis. And the first one is when you're in crisis, people do come together and they act. And they do, you know, they have that sense of agency. It's like a bereavement. People gather around. But the next phase is regression, where it's, you know, people become aware that, well, actually this isn't going away. It's going to stretch on. People start getting anxious, and the challenge, I think, is how you kind of translate that into the third phase, which is recovery. And I personally believe we're not going to get into that phase of recovery because, again, the climate emergency is still here. If we let go of that sense of community that we experienced in crisis. So, if that makes any sense at all, I don't know.
And that leads me really nicely onto my next question, actually, Alistair, which is, you know, everything that we know about change management is that it really helps to have that burning platform. It helps to have a common goal. It helps. So in some ways, COVID did provide all that for everyone. But we can't stay in an emotionally in a crisis mode. And I accept that we've got different, and local government has lots of different crises to deal with, but we can't be in the place, I don't think, and keep any sort of resilience where all of our workforce are all in this hyper aware, we've got a massive problem to deal with. So my question, which is a tough question, back to the panel, is how do we keep up the good work of the pace, of the communication, of the relation? How do we keep all of that good work up whilst we come out of that psychological crisis mode? And it might be too early to answer that question yet, but I'd be really interested to know what your thoughts are. Does anybody want to take that one first? Carol?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a question that Rob asked, really, in the chat area. You know, I think we need to celebrate, actually, what we've done and what's been good about it. So identifying what we've been able to achieve through a different operating method. So in Alistair's case, you know, through community. In our case, just in having to respond differently. And I think, you know, talking about that and making our staff and our students aware of what we've done differently, and actually what's been good about that and what hasn't been good about it. But that's okay, because as we said, we weren't going to be perfect. It's really important. And I think asking the questions, what are we going to stop doing now then? On the basis that we've been doing things, it may be much, much harder, Alistair, in local government. I have not worked in local government for a long time, so I've not been subject to the same sort of level of austerity. But, you know, if I think about some of the ridiculous things we do in a university, like, well, what are we going to stop doing? Because we don't have to do that anymore, because we've not had to do it. So let's stop it. What have we done differently that we've really liked and that we want to keep doing differently? And then what did we stop because we had to, we didn't have the time, or it just wasn't right, that actually we still want to hold on to? So get people thinking about just the lessons they've learned, and then how can we change that? How can we change that for the longer term, as opposed to just saying, well, that was then, we're all going to go back to work now. I mean, thankfully, we're not all going to go back to work now. Whether that's good or bad, you know, my staff are going to be home working for a very long time. Some of my academic colleagues are going to be back on campus, but they're not going to be working full time on campus because we can't offer a safe working environment. So we're going to have to see this through for a longer period. And I think whilst we're seeing it through for a longer period, we just need to be asking ourselves those questions and then make some changes for good.
Thank you. Sanjay?
I think, celebrating the successes is really good, and actually creating the time to do that and pausing for a minute to do that. That seems like a bit of a challenge with the people I'm working with, like creating that space to just go, hold on, let's pause and celebrate. But I totally agree with what Carol's saying. I guess my first reflection on the question, Lucy, is that people are really tired, and I don't think we've necessarily, well, I know that we haven't ended, this crisis is still ongoing, isn't it? The measures kind of that the government are announcing are kind of, as they always have been, changing every day in some cases, but it's easing. We know that. But we also know that there's potential further peaks in the autumn and maybe early next year. We've seen across the world other peaks already starting to appear in China, for example. And God, is that slightly depressing and exhausting, having been through a really, really long crisis period of a good 3 months and the number of days that Alistair has been counting. And how do we sustain pace? Well, the pace of change is really important, but people are knackered, and finding the time to be able to do the good enough reflection at this juncture, when the crisis, or the pandemic, let's say, is far from over. The crisis phase is over, but the pandemic is far from over. It's really hard. It's really, really tough. Normally, in normal circumstances, you'd have a bit of a breather, have a bit of a break. You'd go on holiday, you'd take a break. How many people are going to have a chance in the next couple of months to have that breather, have that break that's needed, when actually the demands are to sort of plan and think about what next? What I just posted in the chat was a bit of a framework that I've been using with Haringey to kind of take through, and I'm happy to dig it out and share it because it's shamelessly stolen from the RSA. And it's really simple. It's just sort of, at this stage, what do you think you want to hang on to? What do you think you want to kind of get rid of and let go? What do you want to kind of restart in some form? And what do you want to amplify that you started during the crisis phase? And it's just helped, just sort of at this juncture, as I say, just get some thoughts out of people's minds and unpack their feeling. But I've been doing that in a way that sort of almost says, but you know what, we're not, this isn't kind of over. So if you're thinking about hanging on to something or doing something differently, what does that look like in the face of continued uncertainty in the next few months? And it's almost like, to me, the pace of change has, in some cases in the organisation I'm working with, happened so quickly. The Director of Adult Services, for example, the other day said that what they wanted to do and had planned to do over the next 3 years on prevention early intervention, which would have saved X amount of money, they've actually achieved £1 million worth of savings already on doing that, because of a particular thing that they did. The learning service, the adult learning service for the borough, which went entirely online, is now never going to go back to doing face-to-face, because they've figured out and doing some thinking that they can actually reach 5 or 6 times the number of people with the online learning platform that they've created as a result of COVID. And actually, when they look at the ongoing crisis, they know that people's personal economic circumstances, i.e. their jobs or their training and education opportunities, are going to be limited in a face-to-face format. So actually that will start to address some of those inequalities at a rapid rate in trying to offer something like that. But also, as a service delivery model, you can still flex it if you need to go back into lockdown. And that's probably one of the cleanest examples I've given you, because as you can imagine, others, it's not quite so easy to think in that way and actually unpack it. But I think I'll just return to my first point. I do think we need to just acknowledge fatigue and the long-term mental health impact that this crisis, this pandemic, will have on people. I think we're far from understanding what that looks like, and we probably won't until we head well into next year. But it's just worth kind of thinking about, I think, pace in light of fatigue, because it's just really important.
Yeah, I'd kind of like to sort of follow on from that a little bit. So we've been having these community-facing meetings, and just as I count the days, I count the meetings. We're up to 62, and you can feel that fatigue out there. You can feel it. In terms of our staff, I had my first physically distant meeting with the leader of the council sat in front of the town hall, and one of them, our people walked past, and she's a first aid mental aider, and she's been leading. I mean, her previous her job is admin in the executive office, but she's led, and that's an example of someone being freed up to do things, and it's energized her. But as she said, people are really afraid. There hasn't been any furlough for our staff. I think there's probably some resentment in that, in terms of some of the things they see on social media when people are talking about building model ships and the things they've been doing during furlough. That's particular class perspective. So there is that weariness, and I don't like to bang on about it, about the living in crisis, and we can't keep living in crisis. But unfortunately, we are going to continue living in crisis. It's not, the crisis isn't going to go away. We're probably looking at an economic meltdown that's possibly unimaginable. If you keep an eye on the claimant figures, that they've doubled since December. The long-term impact economically is quite worrying. The psychological mental health impact is incredibly worrying. I've got teenagers. There's a meeting the other day. Someone from the police was saying that when we first went into lockdown, it went back to 1950s policing. Their demands at that time were 50%, now 150%, and their biggest demand is around personal safety and suicide, and that's where we are now. So that's all grim, but I think recovery starts with honesty. That's where I sit. We need to be honest about where we are, and we need to find some hope. And I think the germs of that are in the new connections that we've made with community, and the opening up that we've seen, certainly locally, between local government and the community. From a council perspective, I think part of that hope is bringing people together to plan for the future. So we've given some kind of aims, something that's manageable, something that people can do. Giving people something that they can do and a sense of agency. I don't think there's an easy answer to your question, Lucy, because we're going to stay in crisis. I don't like to be the doom person and everything else, but we are in Western society, well, in the world, we're in crisis, and it's not going to go away. So it's really about how do we support each other and move forward in crisis, I think.
Thank you. I have a final question that I'd love to ask all four of the panel members, which is if you were in charge of training the next generation of change leaders, what in a nutshell, what wisdom would you pass on, that if you're about to start to deal with a huge change in an organisation, based on what you've learned in your experience of leading change during COVID, what advice would you give them? Would anybody like to take that one first?
Listen. I think my advice would be to listen to as many people as you possibly can, and listen to yourself. And focus on strengths. I'll just say that. Focus on strengths, focus on connections, focus on relationships, and challenge deficit culture.
I think I would endorse those, but I would also encourage the leader to demonstrate good leadership and consistent leadership and encouragement and passion and things like that. I think that going back to this previous discussion, I think a lot of technology has shown some of the weaknesses of the previous system that we've had, that we've potentially have been covered up. So I think that there's some challenge there to look at what the opportunities are. And I'm going to be sort of maybe counter rebellious and say that actually, I personally, I have seen quite a lot of advantages in lockdown, because I don't travel around the country as much as I used to. And I did 4 meetings in a day. One should have been in London, one should have been in Durham, one should have been in Blackburn, and one should have been in Chester. And the fact that to do those meetings, that you don't actually have to travel to those meetings, meant I could do 4 meetings in one day that it would have taken me 4 days to go. So personally, my health and well-being, I think, has been enhanced by lockdown, believe it or not. So and I think that it's seeing what some of the advantages are and encouraging people to see some of the health and well-being positives in some of this. And okay, I accept that I may not be dealing with some of the challenges that other people are dealing with, but I think it's worth reflecting on that. There are some positive things out there, and the challenge going forward will be for us not to lose those, and to try and keep in place some of the things that we've learned. Some of the things that we've learned that become common practice, and we don't, some of those things are really good. We don't revert back to just doing them how we did them before.
I would add into that, in terms of advice to change leaders, is the importance of being human. Has never been greater, I think, and I agree entirely with the leadership kind of point that's been made, because to really change something, you have to take risks, you have to trust in your instincts, you have to be human, you have to collaborate. I think that's the sort of modern change leader does as well. But ultimately, when you take risks, they could pay off and they don't pay off, but when they do pay off, that is where the most effective change tends to be happening, and the best examples you will see in history. Let's be honest, that's where the person has stood up and they've gone, we should do this, and they have. I think in our context with this crisis, the need to tune in and be human and do what's right has just moved up the level of importance for me, because that's really where the energy comes from for changing the communities, the society that we sort of are living in going forward. I can't tell you how many people I have observed take some huge, sometimes personal risks in this last few months, and some that have paid off and some that weren't. But what they can track back to is the fact that they can explain why they did that and why they did it, from the fact of what they were trying to do, tuning into kind of what a human being would do instinctively. And so that would be my advice, is you've got to continue to be bold, take those risks. But
I'd echo a lot of Sanjay's comment, well, a lot of everybody's comments really. Take a risk, actually. Stop being in charge and let other people's brilliance come to the fore, and be prepared to say, oh, I don't know the answer. Has anybody got an answer? Has anybody got an idea? So I'd also say for leaders, leave your crap at home. So leave your leadership crap. Oh, my life is so difficult. It's all too hard. You don't realise the serious things I've got to deal with. Leave it to one side, because actually when you're dealing in a situation that needs change to happen quickly, nobody's interested in what's going on for you. Actually, you need to be interested in what's going on for them. So it's a bit like if we take we need to change. The Black Lives Matter stuff tells us we need to change. I think we all knew that, but actually it's highlighted a hell of a lot. And what do we know? Just listen. Let people tell you about what it's like living in their shoes, and actually be prepared to learn from that, instead of thinking as a leader you have to have all the answers. Just be different.
Thank you. So I'm getting a real sense of park your ego there, which personally, when we're leading change programs, I'm such a massive advocate of co-design, of getting in there and working with frontline staff who know far better than us how to make it better, and actually just need a voice and need to be heard, and will produce much better change outcomes than perhaps a group of senior managers locked away in a room with a bit of paper on the wall. So I think that's really nice to hear. And also the good leadership, the being human. And I do think that what COVID has given us is a real sense of a focus on do what's right. And it's been, as the speaker said earlier, it's affected everybody in different ways. So I think it's been easy for people to connect to and taking risks. And I hope to see, certainly when we work in organisations, they tend to be quite big organisations, I really hope to see some letting go of bureaucracy and of encouraging that and empowerment and that taking risk going forward. I think probably the fear of risk is one of the biggest enemies of change that you have in big organisations, along with the ego of people that kind of want to keep things as they are. So it's been really lovely to hear from everyone that during such a difficult time for us all, that there is positive stuff going on and organisations reacting. And I do agree with Norman to some degree. There are some really lovely positive things that will hopefully we're putting in place now, whether it's people's health and well-being, whether it's connections with communities, whether it's just our working relationships with each other and seeing people as more human, that I really do hope to continue. And I hope we don't rush back to that corporate way of living, of almost being robots. So huge thank you to all the speakers for taking part in today, and also everybody that has come on the call to listen. We would love to keep in touch with everybody that's been part of this process, so we are going to send out a feedback form to everybody that's been part of this process to hear how you found it, what kind of topics you'd like us to talk about going forward. We do have another one in the calendar, which is next Wednesday, and that is specific around making that transition from being perhaps an office-based organisation to remote working. Carol, I think you're on that call as well next Wednesday, so please do dial into that. You can register for that on our website. And we're hoping to put some more on in the next few weeks around communications, around resilience, which is very much around that healing that we've been talking about today. I think that's going to be really important going forward. And HR impact, and also pulling teams together, because I think there's so much to be learned. I've seen lots of examples of organisations just parking their own brand and their own lanyard and their own badge and just chucking teams in together to work for what's right and what's good, rather than associated to what team you're in. So I think there's lots of learning to be had there. And do follow us on social media, where we will advertise those dates as soon as we get them booked in. And if you'd like to talk to us at all, or any of the speakers that to kind of keep in touch and learn a bit more, then please do get in touch with us through our website. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks very much.